People were unloading boxes from a truck. Who would have imagined that a person could have a replacement who does all the work for him? The guy was lifting weights in the gym. The balance of the card appeared on the phone screen. This replacement could do anything. The young man was sitting in a sun lounger on the beach. His dream came true. The boy took off his sunglasses and thought about how he had such a life. A giant dragon attacked the city. The main character fell to the ground and opened his mouth in fear. His house was almost completely destroyed. Dead monsters lay around, putting his weapon on his shoulder. The hunter asked his friend to collect all the corpses and thought about how hard he worked to get the most comfortable life. The monster hit the ground with its paw with force. The demon opened its mouth wide and screamed. The guy decided that it might seem stupid that he was doing everything possible just to eat and play for his own pleasure. The young man smiled nervously and assessed the size of the enemy. The monster's eyes lit up. The hunter frowned sternly and ordered everyone to attack. Realizing that he would never be alone, his squad charged at the monster. Two fighters jumped into the air above the enemy's head. The protagonist swung his sword. Red lightning flashed around him. The rest of his team held the demon down. Surrounded by his comrades, the boy delivered a crushing blow and thought about his special skill, cloning. A monitor was on in the dark room. A notebook was lying on the desk. There were bowls of food in the kitchen. The young man thought about how there were so many things in this life that he needed to do, but there were just as many things that he wanted to do. He was playing a computer game. The protagonist imagined himself sitting on a cliff and realized that he wanted to travel. The boy imagined clinking glasses with his friends and wanted to spend more time with them. The young man mentally took the hand of a girl and realized that he wanted to go on dates. A smile appeared on his face. He wondered why a person could only do one thing at a time and remembered that he always wanted to have two bodies. His clone appeared in front of him. His dream came true. People were walking along the busy streets. The bully smirked and said that he would definitely get a cool skill when he awakens. His comrade chuckled and said that he could use a skill that raises intelligence. Walking along the street, the boy found his life tiring. The protagonist looked away and wanted to get home as soon as possible. A crowd of people walked in front of him. He really wanted to have two bodies. The man brought the microphone to his mouth and asked for a moment of attention. The A-class hunter looked up and announced that he would be in charge of the 10th Portal Awakening program. Lightning enveloped the man's body. It turned out that this was a program launched by the government to help awaken abilities during which people must cross a portal. Waving his hand, Bonte hoped that the city's residents would successfully complete their awakening and suggested starting right now. The first group stepped forward and stood in line. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and realized that his turn would soon come. Holding documents in her hands, the girl greeted him and clarified his number and group. The guy confirmed that he was number 7 in the 37th group. The woman brought a scanner to his hand to check his identity. She pointed to the portal with her hand and asked the candidate to enter it, having previously left all his equipment here. The young man took a step forward. Bright lightning struck from the black rift. The student's eyes widened in surprise. The protagonist closed his eyes and stuck his hand into the portal. User identification began, and soon the system reported the completion of registration. Sono opened his eyes wide. Putting his hand to his head, he felt severe pain and realized that he had momentarily lost consciousness. The people found themselves in a building with drones flying under the ceiling. The guy frowned in disappointment and noticed that he wasn't the only one who felt sick. The girl summoned a fire phoenix and was happy that she got such an amazing ability. People from different guilds immediately ran up to her to recruit her. Someone approached the young man, smiling. The stranger congratulated him on waking up and asked how he was feeling. The student stood up and said that he was feeling sick. The man said that it would soon pass and asked if he had checked his skill. The protagonist frowned and said that he was just about to do that. A status window appeared in front of him. Sonu's eyes widened in surprise. He said that he had gotten the cloning skill. As soon as he thought about it, the guy looked at the values of his characteristics and was upset that they were so low. The young man raised his eyebrows and decided to check the skill description. The system reported that the maximum number of clones depends on the user's level and is currently equal to 1. The student thoughtfully scratched his chin. The awakened man's mouth dropped open in shock when he read that there were no special conditions for using this skill, and he realized that it could be used for everyday activities as well. The stranger folded his hands behind his back and decided that his friend had already finished checking his status window. The protagonist confirmed. He said that everything was not so good. Smiling, the man asked him not to be upset, since all newbies have rather weak initial indicators, and asked what his skill was. Deciding not to hide it, Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and replied that he had received cloning. The guild representative stared at him in amazement and grinned. The boy looked at him in confusion. He tilted his head and asked if it was really that bad. The stranger told him that there was a person with the illusion cloning skill, but since his clones did not have a physical shell, they could not do anything. The young man smiled and thought that his clones were not illusion. The man raised his hands and explained that this was much better than awakening without a skill, and said that he could show his skill to the officials standing nearby so they could evaluate it more accurately. The student looked around. A crowd of people had gathered behind him. The boy raised his hand and it immediately turned to stone. The representatives of the different guilds were watching him carefully. The awakened man frowned sadly. The protagonist asked where the exit was. The stranger smiled and explained that before leaving this place, he needed to undergo a final scan and register with the research team. People entered the capsule one by one. White smoke appeared around Sangwoo. The man sitting at the laptop confirmed his skill and said that the probability of manifesting one or more skills was 73%. The employee raised his eyebrows and said that he had registered the cloning skill and that the registration form had been sent to the ID bracelet. The handrails on the bus swung from side to side. The guy looked at his bracelet and thought that everything had ended faster than expected. A wave appeared on the small screen. The young man wondered what his new skill truly was. Clouds were floating above the city. The student entered the apartment and asked if his comrades had done a good job. There were several monitors on his computer desk. A battle was taking place on the screen. The awakened one sat down in a chair. He put his hands on the keyboard and decided to check something. An inventory and a description of the shield appeared on the screen, which the player did not like very much. The main character lay down on the bed and said that he did not care. Staring at the ceiling, Sangwoo thought about the fact that the popularity of games was falling anyway and decided to hope for the release of some new game. Putting his hands under his head, the guy remembered that he needed to pay for tuition and rent, and wished that someone else could get a job instead of him. The young man jumped out of bed and remembered his skill. He looked at the ID bracelet and decided to check its effect. The student stood in the center of the room. Waves of light energy appeared around him. An aura enveloped his body. The awakened one opened his eyes wide and used his skill. A blue haze flew out from his chest. The gamer opened his mouth in fear and screamed. A thick cloud of energy appeared in front of him. A bright light appeared inside it. The flash lit up the room. Someone lowered their hand. Smoke flew around his feet. An exact copy of the protagonist appeared in the room. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows in surprise. A white haze enveloped the double's naked body. He stood firmly on his feet. The guy raised his hand. The young man's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked if it was really a clone. His exact twin raised his eyebrows and confirmed it. The student approached him and asked if he could touch him. The copy allowed him to do so. The awakened one frowned tensely and thought that he was too embarrassed. He slapped himself in the face to come to his senses. The gamer grabbed the double by the shoulder. The protagonist opened his mouth in shock and realized that this was a real physical body, not an illusion. A white haze covered the groin of the completely naked clone. Sangwoo smiled and said that he needed to put something on first. There was a wrinkled sweater on the floor. The twin put it on. The guy remembered that he could give him orders. The young man thought about asking him to sit down, and the copy immediately did so. The student smiled and realized that he didn't even need to say the orders out loud. The double stood up when the awakened one mentally asked him to do so. Then the clone sat down a few more times. His face was covered in beads of sweat due to fatigue. The gamer put his hand to his chin and decided that he had the same stamina as him. The phone vibrated in his pants pocket. The protagonist took it out and saw messages from his comrade. A conversation appeared on the screen. Jando said that he had 2 hunter skills and asked his friend to answer him as soon as possible. Sangwoo started texting while his twin tried to catch his breath. In the chat, his comrade assumed that he had received some stupid ability and began to laugh at him. The guy frowned in displeasure and called him a real chatterbox. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of his face saying that his stamina had increased by 1,000. George was standing on the roof of the building. He was the owner of the Flicker skill, an S-class ranker who became the first person to pass Odine's tower, which no one had been able to conquer before. The elevator doors in the main building of the Enlightenment Group opened. The guild employee entered the office and reported that at the moment, according to the analysis, 80% of the population of 300 million people were awakened. The guild leader asked how long it would take for a 100% to awake. The girl looked at the tablet and explained that, given the number of participants in the awakening program, they could expect it within the next 5 years. Looking at the city, the jumper decided that it was not that long. George was standing by the panoramic window. A giant skyscraper rushed into the sky. The protagonist went for a run. His face turned red and was covered in beads of sweat. The athletes sitting on the bench noticed him. One of them assumed that he would soon faint because he was running in such clothes. Sangwoo sat down on the bench. Someone handed him a bottle of water. The stranger smiled and offered him a drink before the next lap. The guy opened his mouth but remained silent. At that moment, the young man got up from the bench and ran on. The woman looked after him and assumed that he was just an introvert. The student ran through the park. At home, he woke up, stood on the scale, and saw that he weighed 78 kg. The slimmed-down gamer pursed his lips. His body had become a little more athletic. Scratching the back of his head, the protagonist realized that he had lost 9 kg this month despite the constant feeling of hunger, and thought that he was doing nothing, yet his body was getting better day by day. Sangwoo looked at the notifications about the increase in characteristics and decided that it was not for nothing that they say skills come from a person's hidden desires. The guy sat down in a chair and remembered that he had learned something while using clones. The young man imagined how he hit his copy and how it ran around the park and concluded that its pain and fatigue were not transmitted to him. After an exhausting run, the double melted into thin air. Clones disappear if they receive damage or spend energy above the limit. The student looked at his twin. Its appearance directly depended on the appearance of the owner. While the awakened one lay on the bed, his copy continued to exercise despite the large distance between them. The gamer clenched his fist and ordered the double to use his skill, but this was impossible. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought that this was quite logical, since otherwise he would have an infinite number of clones. Some time ago, Sangwoo was sitting at the computer in complete darkness. The hunter's wiki appeared on the monitor. The boy raised his eyebrows and realized that he never thought this day would come. A search bar appeared on the main page. It turned out that there were normal and special stats, but most awakened ones only had normal ones, and the method to unlock special stats was still unknown, with a few exceptions. A status window appeared in front of the boy. His stats increased slightly. The student smiled and thought that he was able to raise his stats so quickly because the clone was training non-stop and doing everything possible to fulfill the order until he reached the limit. The awakened one put his hand behind his head and wondered if this meant that he could double the points he got if he moved with the clone. The gamer picked up a flyer for a gym. The flyer said that this gym provided a personal trainer and a full range of exercises. The protagonist looked up from the flyer. A battle was taking place on the computer screen. Sangwoo smiled and decided that he would be the head, and his double would be the limbs. The guy unlocked his phone and looked at his balance. The young man frowned and realized that he didn't have enough money to pay for the registration. The student looked ahead and remembered that he had spent a lot of money on food. He looked away and decided that he needed to find a part-time job. The awakened one placed his hands on the keyboard. The gamer raised his eyebrows and thought that he needed to find some construction work because it would help him train his body and earn money at the same time. The protagonist looked at the list of vacancies and realized that he should do it himself first, because the clone would not be able to succeed if he was given an order in an area unknown to both of them. Sangwoo frowned with interest. A description of a vacancy appeared on the monitor for the Webtoon Logistics Center, which was looking for a delivery worker. The guy pressed the call button, considering this vacancy ideal. The young man put the phone to his ear and said that he saw an advert for workers on the website. The manager explained that there would be no preliminary interview and that he could come straight away and start working. Sitting in front of the computer, the student said that he wanted to start working tomorrow. He raised his eyebrows in surprise when the employee of the center asked if he could start working today. The awakened one looked away and answered that it was possible. The employee of the company said that he would be waiting for him at the logistics center at 6. The gamer pressed the end call button and wondered if there was no one else working there. The protagonist leaned on his hand and decided that he did not care, as long as he was paid. The trucks left the center. Sangwoo put his hands in his pockets and assumed that this was the very place. His clone's face was hidden under a mask and a cap. The guy looked at him and decided that if he said this was his twin, something could go wrong. The young man raised his hand and asked his double to answer questions well and call himself Jundo while working. Scratching his head, the student thought that this building was too big and wondered where he should go. The awakened one raised his eyebrows in surprise when someone called out to him. The man smiled widely and asked what brought him here. The gamer opened his mouth wide and recognized him. Doc Chill. He shook his hand and said that he didn't even recognize him because he had lost weight. The protagonist thanked him and explained that he came here with a friend for a part-time job. The employee pointed at the building and said that he should go there since the office was located inside. Sangwoo scratched the back of his head and thanked him. The man said goodbye. The guy put his hands to his cheeks and thought that his nerves couldn't stand this. The young man looked through his fingers. The student asked if his copy was nervous. Number 1 looked at him and said no. The awakened one looked at his bracelet with confidence and remembered that he now had strength. The gamer went ahead and suggested that they finish their business quickly and go home to eat ramen. The exhausted protagonist lay down on the boxes and realized that he had been too confident in himself because the delivery work was too difficult. The clone took a large box. A loader was dragging the box to the car. The company employee was sorting out the cargo in the warehouse. Sangwoo raised his head with difficulty and wondered if these people really had any skill in dragging heavy things. Doc Chill extended his hands to help the double remove the box. The sweaty guy realized that he should not have come here because his copy was doing just fine on its own. There were trucks parked near the center. An hour-long break was announced. The guys were sitting by the wall of the building. The young man looked very tired. Someone handed him a can of soda. The man smiled and explained that he needed to replenish the fluids in his body. The student thanked him. A local worker sat down opposite him and asked the name of the diligent loader who had not said a word during this time. Number 1 introduced himself with a false name. The center employee smiled widely and concluded that his friend was doing this kind of work for the first time. Looking up, the awakened one confirmed this and called the work quite tiring. Sitting opposite him, Doc Chill chuckled and said that he and his friend had courage, since most of the guys would have already run away by now. The gamer tensely pursed his lips and thought that he would have been among them too if not for the money. The man looked at him and asked where he studied. The protagonist answered that he studied at Yongguk University. The clone drank the soda in one gulp. The local worker called Yongguk a great school. Sangwoo replied that he could not say the same. Looking away, the center employee asked him not to be modest and explained that he would give anything for his daughter to go there. Smiling, the guy asked him not to worry about it and told him that he also didn't do very well in school, but still managed to get in. Doc Chill raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked how he managed to do it. The young man replied that he was able to get a couple of licenses and a special permit. The man happily raised his hand and said that this was a great option. Suddenly, he thoughtfully raised his fist to his chin. The local worker smiled and asked if his friend wanted to get another part-time job. The student opened his mouth in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The center employee extended his hand and offered that he tutor his daughter instead of getting tired here. The awakened one widened his eyes in shock. The gamer thoughtfully looked away. A phone screen appeared in his memory showing the meager balance of his card. The protagonist frowned in confusion. Sangwoo extended his hand forward and asked if he would need to tutor her in all subjects. Doc Chill confirmed this and explained that he was embarrassed to say such a thing about his own daughter, but she was actually a bad student. The man spread his fingers and offered 50,000 for each 2-hour lesson, a couple of times a week. The boy looked away and decided that it wasn't that bad, considering the time it took. The boy shook his friend's hand and agreed. The local worker thanked him for his help. Standing up, he promised to contact him after discussing it with his daughter and asked if he still had his old phone number, which the student confirmed. The awakened one looked up at the sky and hoped that everything would work out with the tutoring. A notification about the increase in stats appeared in front of him. The gamer smiled widely and was happy that he got both the job and the stats. The loader left the warehouse. The protagonist turned around and remembered that he still had something to do. Sonu opened the black bag and decided to have a snack. However, the bag was empty. Number 1 was already eating his second sandwich in a row. The boy smiled nervously and closed his eyes. The clone threw an entire bag of buns into his mouth. Sitting opposite him, the young man asked if he had really eaten everything. The next morning, the student was lying on his bed. The awakened one gritted his teeth and said that he was about to die. The gamer got out of bed and decided to use the double for this part-time job from now on. A message about increasing characteristics appeared next to him. The protagonist realized that the twin was still working. Closing his eyes, Sangwoo asked him to come back and thought about how he wanted to recall him and call him again, because if he didn't do this at home, his clothes would disappear. There was a pot of soup on the table. The guy smiled broadly and was glad that he was able to eat a hearty meal. Suddenly, the young man looked down. The door of the apartment opened. Number 1 came inside and announced his return. The student looked at him in surprise and asked him to wash himself and change his clothes. Water dripped from the shower. There was dirty laundry in the basket. The awakened one approached the clone who had just come out of the shower. The gamer frowned and asked him to give him a hand. The double raised his hand. The tense protagonist took a sharp needle in his hand. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. Sonu remembered that if the copy was recalled, his body would scatter in the wind because it was not a person and not a living creature at all. The guy pierced number 1's finger with a needle. A drop of blood appeared on it. The clone looked ahead indifferently. The young man took a handkerchief and asked him for forgiveness. The rag absorbed the blood. The student wondered when the regeneration characteristic would become available to him. A description of regeneration appeared on the hunter's wiki page, which said it could be mastered by constantly leaving wounds on your body. The awakened one leaned on his hand and asked himself if this characteristic would appear if he did this for another month. The gamer pursed his lips and thought that he was afraid to inflict a wound bigger than this, so he should stop there. The protagonist looked at the doppelganger and asked him to eat ramen whenever he felt hungry and to continue training. Sangwoo handed him his spare phone and told him to take it when he went to work and to make sure to answer his calls. The sun's rays illuminated the houses. The guy was walking down the street holding an advertising flyer. Suddenly, someone put a hand on his shoulder. The young man turned his head and saw his friend. The student removed his hand and said that it was too hot today. Yando was surprised that his friend had lost so much weight. The awakened one narrowed his eyes and explained that he was working out and was on his way to the gym. Putting his hands on his stomach, the brunette said that these were also muscles and asked which gym he was going to. The gamer replied that the gym was called Strong Body. The man gave him a thumbs up and said that it was a good place. The protagonist raised an eyebrow and remarked that he didn't see anything special about it, except the price. The guy smiled broadly and said that the trainer there was a real beauty. The young man grabbed his friend by the shoulders and offered to go there together. Sonu realized that his friend didn't go there to exercise at all. Bright lamps illuminated the corridor. A pumped-up man was lifting dumbbells. Treadmills stood along the wall. An athlete was lifting a barbell. Someone was eating meat with chopsticks. The guys entered the gym, scratching the back of his head. A local employee apologized and greeted the guests. The hero said that they would like to register. The gym employees smiled and told them that they had discounts on the occasion of the opening, so if they took a subscription for 3 months, it would cost them only 160,000 kali. The guy raised his index finger and decided to take the membership. He asked if the trainer could check whether he was using each machine correctly. The man put his hands on the table, agreed to help him, and offered to assist with the payment. There were many different machines in the gym. The young man lifted the barbell with difficulty. The student stood up from the machine, and the local worker explained that this was how to do an incline bench press. He suggested that the student gradually increase the weight and speed up. An athlete lifted the barbell and screamed loudly. There were 4 50 kg plates on each side. The guys looked at the athlete in shock. The gym goer holding the dumbbell opened his mouth in surprise. The man working out on the treadmill widened his eyes in amazement. The strong man secured the barbell to the stand. Yando tensed his arm to show off his pumped-up muscles. The trainer approached him and assumed that he had been working out for a long time. The brunette replied that this was his first time. The gym employee put his hand on his chin and suggested that Jando had a power boost after awakening. He asked what his current level was. The guy replied that he had 2 units of power. The awakened guy raised his eyebrows in surprise and realized that the skill his friend had never talked about was power. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The gamer wondered how strong other high-class hunters were if a simple power boost skill had such a serious effect. Sitting on the bench, the protagonist realized that it was not for nothing that everyone only talked about hunters. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Samu picked up the phone and heard Doc Chill's voice. Holding the phone to his ear, the guy heard that his colleague had already talked about tutoring with his wife and daughter and wanted to know if he had time right now. The young man stood up and confirmed this. The man offered to meet him at their house to talk. The bright sun illuminated the city. Standing in the elevator, the student was upset that Jiando had not registered even after that performance. The brunette pointed at himself and said that his friend would not be able to work out properly if he signed up for the gym. The awakened one asked him to admit that this didn't happen only because there was no cute trainer there today. The athlete looked down and confirmed this. The gamer put his hands in his pockets and decided that it would be even better this way because he would not have to worry about the clone. There was a sign with an apartment number on the door. The protagonist realized that this was the right address. Sunu put his ear to the door and heard disgruntled shouts. It turned out that no one knew the tutor was coming. Dakseol abruptly opened the door and said that he was going to work, so his daughter could tell the tutor herself if she didn't like something. The man looked back and opened his mouth in amazement. The guy who was hit with the door put his hand to his cheek. A young girl came out into the hallway. The schoolgirl's eyes widened in surprise. The young man put a rag to his head. An employee of the logistics center approached him and apologized for not noticing him. The student replied that everything was fine. Someone put a plate of sliced apples on the table. The woman smiled broadly and said that she did not recognize the boy. The awakened one explained that he had been playing sports recently and that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The gamer removed the rag from his head. His knees trembled when the protagonist asked if she was his student. The girl blushed in embarrassment and confirmed it. Her parents smiled widely since their daughter had been complaining about tutoring just a few seconds ago. Sangwoo introduced himself and asked if she really wanted to go to Jeong's university. Looking away, the girl confirmed it and thought to herself that she was embarrassed because he had probably heard her screams. The guy smiled and said that he wanted to see her grades before classes started. The schoolgirl's mouth opened in fear. The boy nervously pursed his lips. As he picked up the report card, the penultimate column showed that the student had a rather low rating. She covered her face with her hands in shame. Dakseol carefully picked up his jacket. The man ran to the exit and shouted that he had to go to work. His wife called him a traitor. The student looked up. The girl looked sadly at the floor. The awakened one smiled and said that everything was fine and that he didn't have good SAT scores either. The girl clasped her hands and asked if that was true. Looking at her, the gamer offered to do everything possible to help her get in, and they decided to discuss the class schedule. White clouds floated above the buildings. The protagonist returned to the apartment and thought that they had a long way to go. Some time ago, Sonru poked his finger at the schoolgirl's notebook. The student began to write something diligently. The guy hung the sweater on a hanger and was glad that she was not as hopeless as expected. The young man went to the computer and decided that number one had probably already gone to work. The student raised an eyebrow and remembered that he had given him a spare phone, but if the number of clones increased in the future, he would need to buy another one. Sitting down in his chair, the awakened opened the Hunter Wiki to search for skills similar to his own. The screen showed many items being sold. The gamer flinched in shock when he saw that the familiar skill was selling for 100 million. Tears welled up in his eyes because the teleportation skill scroll was selling for 400 million. The protagonist leaned on his hand and decided that he would buy a house instead of a skill if he had that kind of money. Sonmu leaned back in his chair looking at the screen. The boy thought about how it would take him forever to buy even one skill and wondered if hunters really made so much money that they could afford all that. The young man picked up his phone and saw that his balance was only 200,000. The student lay down on his bed and sighed heavily. The awakened placed his hands under his head and asked himself if he should become a hunter. The gamer opened the news feed on his phone to find information about hunters. He got out of bed. The protagonist frowned tensely and thought that he could not waste such a great skill on slave work. Sangwoo grabbed his sweater, put it on, and decided to try to become a hunter. The system reported the unlocking of the vitality skill. Demons came forward. In the year 2000, portals began to appear all over the earth. At the same time, an army of the undead pursued strong monsters. Because of this incident, later called the Great Catastrophe, more than half of the world's population died. The living dead leaned on his sword. At the same moment when the catastrophe began, Super people with special abilities began to appear. The Awakens stood in the shadows with them on the front lines. Humanity barely managed to win this war. A man took a crystal out of the monster's body. Now a profession for hunting the remaining monsters had appeared. These specialists began to be called hunters. The young man was watching a video on his phone. The lecturer explained that if he passed the test, he could get a state license and legally kill monsters. He put in his earphones at the moment when the teacher suggested analyzing several subtleties that would help in passing the test. The awakened man opened his mouth in surprise. Standing in front of him was a tall building that housed the Hunter Center. The gamer stretched his shoulder and thought that, due to the recently unlocked vitality skill, even a couple of hours of sleep was enough for him to feel alert. The protagonist entered the building. The arms dealer was showing a buyer a sword. Another man was assembling firearms. The stranger's face was hidden by a hat with a long brim. Sanu's eyes widened in amazement. People were walking around the building, but the guy concluded that only a few were actually there to take the test. A girl raised her hand and announced that registration for the exam to obtain a hunter's license, which would take place in the basement, would end in 20 minutes. The young man lowered his head and realized that he was very nervous. There was a sign next to the door that read exam room. The student walked in and apologized. There were many people sitting in the lecture hall, and they all stared at the awakened one. The gamer trembled and wondered why there were so many of them. A bully smirked and laughed at him along with his comrade. A man in a military uniform entered the room and put his hand on the table. Looking up, Mien greeted those present and announced that he would be their examiner. Frowning, the man explained that the licensing exam consisted of a written part, a practical test, and an aptitude test. He warned that anyone caught cheating would be disqualified without the right to retake the exam, and asked if everyone understood. The hunter looked at the lecture hall from under his brows and said, "We do not forgive cheaters?" The bully opened his mouth in amazement. The protagonist frowned tensely and felt a strong pressure. The soldier standing behind the lectern announced the start of the exam. A white car was driving along the road. A stranger said they would transfer everything by the end of the month. Shouts were heard through the earphone. Sitting behind the wheel, a man asked his boss to wait and said that he had been working in this field for several days. He closed his eyes, listening to the shouting of his superiors. The CEO of JM smiled and thought that this could drive a person crazy. The agent raised his eyebrows and said that money does not come easily but flows away like sand through your fingers. The watch on his hand showed 7:45. The man concluded that the hunter exam should be over soon. The car was driving along a long bridge. A message appeared on the identification bracelet, congratulating him on receiving F-class hunter status. The protagonist looked at it in confusion. Sony scratched the back of his head and thought that passing the exam was as easy as getting a driver's license. At first, the guy sat at the table. The questions in the written stage were very simple. You just needed to remember a couple of things. Then the guy went to the shooting range and picked up a gun. Before the practical test, they were given a lot of time to prepare, and the target was hanging quite close. Then they sat at the table with Miman. The aptitude test turned out to be a moral conversation, like something from elementary school. Looking down, the young man thought about how this job involves risking your life and using weapons, and he wondered if it was normal for the entry threshold to be so low. The student turned around. The rays of the setting sun illuminated the building. The awakened one decided that the government seemed to want everyone to become hunters. The protagonist closed his eyes and told himself that he shouldn't worry about it. On the street, people in black suits approached the new hunters. They handed out business cards to everyone who had just passed the exam. One of them held coffee in his hand and chatted pleasantly with a hunter. Sanu raised his eyebrows and assumed that they were representatives from guilds trying to recruit them. Someone handed him a business card and congratulated him on passing the license exam. The boy took the card and saw the name of Agent JM. Junmo smiled and offered to cooperate, promising to give him the best deals when buying or finding items for hunting. The young man scratched his head and thanked him. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of him. The student's eyes widened in surprise when he saw that his cloning skill level had increased and that he had another clone available. When the man started saying something about the agency, the awakened one ran away and promised to contact him later. The CEO burst into tears and asked him not to forget about it. In the evenings, lights were on in the windows of the house. The hunter covered his face with his hand and left. Number 1 stood in front of him. The protagonist decided that nothing could be better than cloning. Another double appeared from the smoke. The copies looked at each other. Sangwoo said that he was looking forward to working together. The guy showed the twins a business card and said that they were now ready to become hunters. Junmo threw the business cards onto the car seat and realized that he had given out almost all of them. The man straightened his tie and hoped that they would contact him. He looked out the window at the official representative office of Korea's leading guild towered over the city. Documents lay on the table. The employee took a sip from his mug and said that his colleague only needed to settle the amount according to what was written in the documents. The CEO of JM took them in his hands and said that he understood everything. Suddenly, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. The documents in his hands contained the total prices for different monsters. The agent, carefully studying the documents, noticed that the amount looked rather suspicious. Troll blood should cost much more. Sitting in a chair, his colleague called him over. The employee grinned and remembered that his comrade had long wanted to join the guild, which meant he should start thinking for himself. Junmo's eyes widened in surprise. The man put the mug on the table and asked, "What will we be left with if we follow all the rules?" The employee put his hand on his colleague's shoulder and asked him not to interfere in the internal affairs of the guild. The CEO of JM tensely clutched the documents in his hand. Sitting in the car, he thought that he would have kept quiet if he had known how hard it would be for him. The phone rang in the inside pocket of his jacket. The agent stuck his hand in to take it out. Junmo put the phone to his ear. The protagonist introduced himself and said that he would like to clarify a few things. There were many signs on the buildings. The man entered a cafe. Sangwoo, who was sitting at the table, called him over. The CEO of JM sat down across from him and apologized for being late. The guy replied that he had just arrived. The cashier was standing behind the counter. The two decided to order a drink. There was iced coffee on the table. Smiling, the agent asked if his client would like to go to a territory that even a newbie could handle. Upon hearing an affirmative answer, he asked permission to know his skill. Holding the coffee in his hand, the young man replied that his skill was cloning. Junmo put his hand to his chin and remembered that this was a skill that created illusions incapable of doing anything. The student drank all the coffee in one gulp. The man realized this was a newbie with illusions that were physically incapable of anything and wouldn't help in hunting. Handing him the documents, the CEO of JM called his skill excellent and asked him to read the terms of the contract. With his arms outstretched, the agent recommended the slime hunting grounds because they had the least dangerous monsters. He explained that one must wear a mask and protective clothing to enter, and that they should not stay there too long because of the toxic fumes. The awakened one took a picture of the contract and said it would not be a problem for him. Junmo raised his hand and added that there was also the horned hare hunting grounds, which had a safe barrier for shooting. However, the prey was hard to catch, making it very difficult to earn money. The hunter carefully studied the contract. The man said that there were also low-class monsters such as giant rats, but only the aforementioned monsters lived in areas where his company could guarantee safety. The protagonist raised his eyebrows and said that he liked both places and that the price of the items for sale also looked attractive. The Sangwoo placed the documents on the table and said he wanted to enter into the contract. The CEO smiled and thanked him. He picked up the notebook and asked which territory the client would choose. The guy stamped it and thought the agent had misunderstood something. The manager winced when he saw that someone else had stamped it. A red mark appeared on the document. Junmo looked away in surprise. The boy smiled and explained that he would be hunting in both places at once. A while ago, a man sitting in his office had asked if his client had the cloning skill. The man in the ninja suit confirmed it. The CEO of JM raised his hand and asked him to show his ability. The awakened one raised 2 fingers and agreed. 2 illusions appeared next to him. Lightning flashed in the office. 4 copies of the skill owner appeared behind him. The agent smiled happily. The clone pulled out a sword from behind his back. The doubles pointed the weapon at their master. The manager raised his eyebrows and asked them to stop. The copy swung the sword. Several blades pierced the hunter at once. Junmo covered his face with his hand in horror. The client asked him to calm down. The man looked at him tensely. The awakened one passed his hand through the sword and explained that it was not real. The CEO of JM tried to touch the sword, but his hand passed through the blade. The clones turned into white smoke. Their master said that this was a good skill to distract monsters. The agent covered his face with his hand and sighed heavily, saying that he had seen enough. Now the manager opened his mouth in shock. He thought about the cloning skill he had just witnessed. It was definitely related to illusions. In front of him sat a double of the main character. Jun Mo remembered how he had held the contract in his hands. In his memory, the copy even drank a glass of coffee. The man gritted his teeth and realized that he had never encountered anything like this before. The CEO of JM looked up and assumed they were twins. Sangwoo closed his eyes and left. The guy pointed at his clone and decided that was a reasonable assumption. The young man placed his hand on the shoulder of the double. He had an indifferent expression. The student explained that his skill could actually be confused with another, but it was not an illusion. The awakened one raised his eyebrows and said that he had another copy, but it was currently at the fitness center. The agent opened his mouth in surprise and asked if clones could really build muscle. Showing him his biceps, the hunter confirmed this and added that his own body also became stronger thanks to it. The manager realized that his client could raise his stats with the help of his doubles. Putting his hand on his chin, Junmo called it amazing and decided that this man had great potential since his skill was completely incompatible with an F-class rating. The protagonist placed his hands on his waist and suggested returning to the issue of the hunting grounds. Sanu raised his hands and asked if there could be problems due to the same person entering two places at once. The man raised his eyebrows and said that there could indeed be issues with this, since there was a record at each entrance. The boy shed tears and decided that his plan wouldn't work. Pointing behind him, the JM CEO promised to talk to the association to find a way to solve the problem. He asked if the client could come with him to scan the bracelet and demonstrate his skill. The boy scratched his head and warned that he would not be able to use the skill until tomorrow evening due to the cooldown. Looking at him and his clone, the agent suggested meeting at the Hunter Center in 2 days. The manager took a pen and remembered the contract. The student picked up the seal and reminded him that he had already stamped the documents. Junmaro suddenly stood up from the table. The man extended his hand and said that he was looking forward to their cooperation. The awakened one smiled. They shook hands. The hunter looked at the man and said that the feeling was mutual. 2 days later, clouds were floating above the skyscraper. The protagonist looked around. Sanu looked back when someone called out to him. The JM executive adjusted his tie and noticed that his client had arrived quite early. The guy explained that he thought they were expecting him and asked if it was true that the association was located in the hunting center. The agent raised his hand and replied that most of the departments operated in that building. A small device issued a ticket with a number. There were many people in the building. A voice invited numbers to different windows. The center employee raised his eyebrows and asked if the visitor really wanted dual access to the hunting areas. Sitting opposite him, the young man confirmed this and explained that he had the cloning skill, but the identification bracelet only existed in one copy. The employee said that he was the first since the jumper to request a duplicate. While the employees were looking for the necessary documents, the student tensely pursed his lips and decided that this was quite expected, since it was not a typical situation. Sometime later, the worker putting a pile of papers on the table explained that it was an application for a permit and asked the visitor to go to the government office to fill out the necessary documents. The heroes opened their mouths in amazement when they saw how many papers there were. Taking them in his hand, the manager promised to sort them out and asked his client to go to the showroom. The awakened one thanked him. Junmo handed the documents to the center employee. The hunter approached the girl in a robe. Lightning flashed around him. A completely naked clone appeared in front of him. The protagonist opened his mouth in fear. The woman adjusted her glasses. The mechanic was working on the machine. The engineer carefully looked at the bracelet. The old man raised his thumb and said that now the doubles could enter the hunting area by scanning their fingerprints. He handed Sang the bracelet and explained that they took into account the possibility of simultaneous entry and exit from different places, as well as repeated entry. The man put his hands on his shoulders and said that his skill had not been seen before, not only in Korea but in the whole world. The guy hugged his double and said that it was time for them to go. The mechanic frowned in disappointment and thought that he would make a great research subject. The young man raised his hand and said that he had settled everything. The CEO of JM congratulated him. The student smiled, glad that the preparations for the solo hunt were finally complete. Raising his eyebrows, the agent confirmed this and asked if his client was going there right now. The awakened one said that he had no other business today anyway. The manager crossed his arms and asked why his copy was hidden behind a mask. The hunter replied that he didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to it. Someone was watching their conversation from the balcony. The stranger standing in the shadows chuckled. Hyung scratched the back of his head, surprised to see this person here. Jin Mo looked back when someone called his name. There was a bang on the balcony. The guild leader jumped down. He smirked and stated that it had been a while since they had seen each other. The protagonist frowned sternly. The man furrowed his brows in disbelief, surprised that his colleague was still dealing with hunters. Sangwoo looked up and realized that the man had just jumped from several stories. The CEO of JM tensely pursed his lips. The agent bit his lower lip and said, "Hello." The scoundrel clutched his stomach and laughed at him. Hyun looked down at him and asked who that boy was. The manager frowned and replied that he was a hunter affiliated with their company. The guild leader raised his eyebrows. The man looked at the boy wearing a hoodie with a large inscription and said that everything was clear to him. He looked down appraisingly. The boy was wearing simple black pants and sneakers. The student looked away in displeasure when the villain suggested that he was only 5th class. He uncovered his face with his hand and decided that his colleague who used to work with C and B-class hunters had completely gone crazy. The guild leader opened his mouth wide and laughed because he couldn't believe that his comrade was supervising an F-class person, and in such an awful hoodie. Junmo's eyes widened in anger. The awakened one placed a hand on his shoulder, a smile shining on his face. The man wiped away a tear. He loomed over the hunter like a menacing shadow and noticed that he apparently had something to say. The protagonist closed his eyes and grinned. Sangwoo rubbed his nose and said that he was very honored to meet the head of the guild, which is considered the first in the country. The villain put his hand to his chin and was glad that there was at least some common sense in his words. The boy covered his face with his hand and declared that his guild was the first in dungeon monopoly and hunting area bans. Hyung looked up. A malicious grin appeared on his face when the boy said that he couldn't believe he was receiving praise from the guild leader who had the highest payout ratio in his favor. The student smiled widely and declared that he didn't even know what to do now. The man scratched the back of his head and called him quite brave. His eyes sparkled. Suddenly, the villain appeared behind the awakened one and asked if his skills were the reason for his bravery. The hunter turned around in fear. The man in the black suit opened his mouth wide and called out to his boss. The assistant ran up to the boss. He was upset that the funbreaker had come. The guild leader let the protagonist go and decided to call it a day. He smirked and asked his name. Sanu raised his eyebrows and suggested that he find out for himself. The man waved his hand, calling him funny, and promised to see his colleague next time. The scoundrel headed toward his employee, who asked him not to act like that inside the building anymore. The heroes were sitting in the car. Jun Mo smiled awkwardly and thanked his friend for his actions. The guy leaned on his hand and explained that he couldn't just stand there and watch. From the driver's seat, the man asked if he knew about his relationship with the Hyam Guild. The young man raised his hand and said that he found out about it while researching the agency. Sitting at the computer, the student noticed that there wasn't much information about him online, but he did find one rumor that concerned his agent. An article from the Hunter Wiki appeared on the screen, where a user wrote that the JM representative was a former Hume Guild employee and warned that those who signed a contract with him would face the road to hell. Holding the steering wheel, the manager realized why no one was joining them anymore. The awakened one explained that people were simply afraid of being targeted by a large guild. Jun Moy asked why the client chose their agency in that case. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The hunter threw up his hands and said that it was all because of the favorable payment ratio. His clone was sitting in the back seat. The protagonist smiled and added that he could trust his comrade if he didn't like something about this industry or the guild. The man's hands shook. The car drove along the highway. There were treadmills in the gym. The athlete's bloody hands were bandaged. His pumped-up legs trembled from the strain. Number 1 was lifting a heavy barbell. The trainer bit his nail in fear. The girl approached him and asked if the man would be okay. The gym employee said that he had already tried to talk to him, but it was pointless. The clone stopped when the notification sounded. The double put the barbell on the rack. He picked up the phone. The owner asked him to finish the workout and wait for him at the entrance to the gym. The copy drank a bottle of water in one gulp. The woman put her hand to her chest and noticed that the visitor had finally finished. Her colleague was happy with the news. Slugs were crawling on the ground. They were crawling along the walls and ceiling of a deep cave. Suddenly, something hit a slug. The man was holding a large sledgehammer in his hand. The awakened one pointed a device, similar to a vacuum cleaner, at the slime. The capsule behind him was almost full. The hunter came out of the portal. The protagonist took off his gas mask and sighed heavily. Junmo approached him and asked how he was doing. Sano replied that it was very difficult to breathe with the mask on. The man crossed his arms and explained that people usually did not come here even though the slug area was considered safe. The boy looked at his torn glove and concluded that he could not last very long here. The young man looked around. The JM executive explained that they could hunt here until the container was full and then simply replace it in the locker. But even a person with great endurance could not last more than 6 hours here. The agent scratched his chin and said that it was possible to stay longer if he purchased a good gas mask and higher class equipment. The student frowned and said that he could hardly last even 2 hours here, let alone 6. The awakened one pointed to his clone and offered him to do it. A gas mask flew into number 2's face. The double tied the laces on his boots. He pulled on rubber gloves. The hunter clenched his fist and wished him luck. As the copy went after the slugs, the protagonist turned his head and decided to head to the field with the rabbits. Sangwoo turned around to call number 1, but he was not there. The boy pouted and remembered that he forgot to pick him up from the gym. The twin was waiting patiently at the entrance to the gym. The clone raised his eyebrows. A white car stopped on the side of the road. The boy looked out the window and asked him to get in. The sun was almost setting. The student winced when Junmo asked why his client called the doppelgangers by numbers. The awakened one smiled and explained that they all looked the same, so giving them interesting names would be confusing. The man raised his eyebrows and agreed that names were not that important when it came to regular copies. The hunter frowned tensely and remembered that pistols were used to hunt horned hares, and the JM CEO confirmed this. The protagonist pouted and asked if he didn't need to prepare some equipment in that case. The agent looked away and said that he didn't need to worry about that. He explained that he could use his own gun or rent the necessary items at the hunting grounds. The manager presented a bunch of different weapons and added that his client would have to get his own equipment because the rented items could only be used at the hunting grounds. Suddenly, Sanu opened his mouth in surprise and asked what that sound was. Junmo smiled and said that they had arrived. There was a military base at the Yugonsen grounds. Soldiers were guarding the outer walls. The traffic controller was waving red batons. The guy got out of the car and remarked that this place was nothing like the slug's territory. The man pointed forward and explained that this was the famous Yugon's territory where the first monster breakthrough occurred. The young man scratched his chin and thought about what he had heard before. The monsters burst out of a rift in the sky. Usually, the portals did not allow monsters to leave, which is why most of the hunting took place inside. The demon pounced on the man with the machine gun. In some cases, they managed to pass through the barrier and destroy the surrounding area. Waves of bright energy swept around the rift. This is what is called a monster breakthrough. Standing by the car, the CEO of JM explained that 5 years had passed and most of the high-ranking monsters had been defeated, but there were still effing rank monsters in the territory, so this place was revered by hunters. The student opened his mouth in amazement and asked if no one complained about this noise. The heroes entered the building. There were many people inside. The agent pointed to the gunsmith and said that everything you need can be rented here. A box of ammunition fell on the table. The base employee picked up a rifle and said that with night vision goggles, earplugs, and bullets, it would cost 700,000. Clutching a credit card, the awakened decided that this was a bit much. Waving his hand, Jun Mo explained that most of it was for the bullets, which would pay for themselves if they successfully hunted rabbits. He added that the price for one horn was comparable to a bucket of tears. As they went up the escalator, the man said that their place was on the 3rd floor of Building F. The hunter asked if the area was divided into zones even inside. The CEO looked back and said that they had arrived. He covered his ears with his fingers when a loud gunshot rang out. People were sitting on the edge of the building firing rifles. A stranger smoked cigarettes and complained about constantly missing. Another awakened held a dead rabbit in his hands. There were several carcasses in a black bag. The protagonist raised his eyebrows in surprise. The agent pointed to his place. The manager squatted down and asked if his client was sure of his shooting skills. Sangwoo pulled out a rifle and smugly confirmed it. The guy looked at the gun and said that he had only missed 3 times during the license exam. Jong-mo remembered that the targets there were quite close. The young man closed his eyes and said that he even felt a little sorry for the horned rabbits. The student put on earplugs. The awakened took aim and said that they would not be able to escape his eagle gaze. The man clenched his fist and was glad that everyone here had earplugs. The hunter took aim at the animal. He opened his mouth wide and shouted that he had found one. It seemed that the hare was looking straight at the sight. The protagonist slowly pulled the trigger. The cartridge case flew into the air. The hunt began. 3 hours later, night had fallen, but gunshots were still ringing out at the military base. Sangwoo covered his face with his hands. The boy lowered his head and realized that he hadn't hit the target even once. The young man threw his head back and declared that it didn't make sense. At that moment, the scope was pointing right at the rabbit's head. The animal raised its ears when the gunshot rang out. The animal immediately ran away. The student closed his eyes and was upset that they were so fast. Not long before, the CEO of JM approached him and said that it was time for him to go. Looking at the night sky, the awakened one realized that he hadn't even recouped the cost of the bullets and decided that he'd had enough for today. Number 1 looked back when the owner called out to him, sitting in a chair. The hunter asked him to shoot rabbits with a gun, take their bodies with a harpoon, and send him a message with the number 1 if he succeeded. The protagonist looked down in disappointment. Inside, heavily, the floodlights illuminated only a small part of the area. Sangwoo decided to go home. Lying in bed, the guy looked at his status window. The young man put his hands on his chest and was glad that number 2 was doing a great job dealing with the slugs. The student raised his eyebrows and noticed that his stats continued to rise in the memory. Young approached him from behind and smirked. The awakened one closed his eyes and thought that he still had a long way to go. The hunter covered his mouth with his hand and yawned. In his mind, the horned rabbit showed him the middle finger. The protagonist decided that catching these monsters unexpectedly turned out to be a complete failure for him. He stared at the ceiling. Sangwoo closed his eyes and hoped that number 1 would catch at least 1 hare. The screen of the phone lying next to his pillow lit up. Many messages appeared on it. The phone vibrated because the clone was sending many messages with the number 1. Clouds floated above the city. There were many signs on the walls of the building. Jun-mo looked out the window. The phone in his pants pocket vibrated. The man picked it up and said hello. Holding the phone to his ear, the CEO heard someone ask if this was the agency Hunter Sangwoo belonged to. The agent frowned and confirmed it. The manager of the slime territory asked him to come over right away and stop his client. The manager's eyes widened in shock when he learned that the clone had been hunting for 24 hours. Jun-mo grabbed his jacket and said that he would come as soon as he could. The guy got up from his bed and said that he had had a really good nap. The young man looked at his phone and noticed the messages, thinking that his double had run out of bullets. Sitting in the lotus position, the student read the messages. The awakened one's eyes widened in shock and asked why there were so many of them. The hunter's mouth dropped open in amazement. The man entered the slime territory and raised his eyebrows in confusion. There were many vials of red liquid on the floor. The CEO of Jam put his hand to his chin and wondered if the double had filled all the tanks in just one day. The men in hazmat suits ran up to their colleague. Blood began to flow from the holes in his gas mask. The agent immediately put the phone to his ear. The protagonist picked up the phone and asked what had happened, smiling widely. The manager reported that his copy had filled all the slime storage facilities in 24 hours and asked him to call number 2 back, as they were going to call in the cleaners. Sangwoo smiled awkwardly and asked if he could send the cleaners to Yu-gain as well. There were dead rabbit bodies on the floor. The shocked men surrounded the pile of corpses. The guy said that it was already difficult to get through. The stranger crossed his arms over his chest and said that he couldn't even count them. Someone was filming the rabbits on a camera. Number 1 sat on a chair. No one could believe that he managed to catch all those rabbits by himself. Someone approached him and said that his skills were simply incredible. The man handed him a business card and introduced himself. Baek put his hand on his chest and asked if the hunter belonged to any guilds. The clone silently looked forward. The leader of the recruiting team smiled nervously and decided that he needed to be patient, since most talented people were very strange. The man behind him crossed his arms and left. There was a crowd of representatives from different guilds nearby. One of them explained that this man was not going to talk to anyone at all. The Brown Bear Guild member opened his mouth in surprise. The men began to curse. At this time, the young man placed a container next to his double. The awakened one looked up and said that these were extra bullets. There were many bullets in the box. The hunter asked the double to continue hunting and hand over the corpses to the agent. The protagonist put his hand on his shoulder and praised him for his excellent work. The twin raised his hands in joy. Number one picked up the rifle. The people around him opened their mouths in surprise when they saw that he had started hunting again. They crowded around him and decided to watch him hunt. There were many books on the shelf. Sangwoo realized that he had underestimated the capabilities of his clones. There were study supplies on the table. The guy thought about the fact that the doubles now receive 50% of his characteristics, which means that they must be half as weak as him. Holding a pen, the boy noticed that they were distinguished by an automatic desire to complete a task and the ability to make a decision without hesitation. The student dropped the pen when someone called out to him and asked what was wrong. Hyung tilted her head and asked what he was thinking. After handing her a piece of paper, the awakened one apologized and said that her results had improved since their last meeting. The girl was happy about this but still wanted an answer to her question. The protagonist leaned on his hand and told her that he had visited the hunting grounds and that everything had gone much better than expected. The girl gaped in surprise and asked if he was a hunter. She stood up from the table and said that she did not know about it. The schoolgirl picked up the phone and asked if her teacher knew the hunter that everyone was talking about on the internet. Sanu asked who exactly she was talking about. The boy choked when the student showed him a video of the god of shooting, the eagle Jensen. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked who they were talking about. The video showed a pile of corpses. Hai said that everyone on the internet was going crazy because of it, and that this person had already killed over 200 rabbits by the time the video was recorded, which was enough to set a new record. People were filming number one on their phones, but the clone didn't say a word when they tried to ask him questions. The double pulled on his cap and only said Eagle Eye Jensen. The people around him decided that this was his nickname. The student's mouth fell open in horror. Looking at the phone, the girl said that she really dreamed of becoming a hunter. The main character asked if she had managed to wake up. The girl looked away and replied that she had received a license but was afraid to go to the hunting grounds. She pursed her lips. The schoolgirl tucked her hair behind her ear and asked if her teacher could go hunting with her if she managed to get a good grade. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and promised to take her with him, only if she could get into the university. The student smiled happily and asked if it was true. The guy confirmed it and said that he also knew some safe hunting grounds. Haijai raised her little finger and asked him to make her a promise. The boy smiled. The heroes hooked each other's little fingers. The girl raised her eyebrows and hoped that he would not change his mind. A gust of wind lifted the curtains. The student asked her friend to continue in the same spirit, and then she would definitely be able to get into Jungkook. After a while, someone opened the door. His mother turned around and opened her mouth wide. Sangwoo smiled and said that the lesson was already over. I was eavesdropping behind the door and heard the protagonist calling her talented and saying that there was nothing to worry about. Sangwoo turned around and said that he would come on Monday. Hang was sweating profusely from excitement. She immediately jumped on the bed, mentally exclaiming that they would have another meeting. The girl looked at the bright sphere and said that he was a hunter, and thanks to this, their communication went smoothly. She smiled and thought that at first she did not like this idea because he was an acquaintance of her father. She remembered his appearance. The girl remembered how he pointed his finger at the notebook and explained something. Hey! Remembered how he smiled. She blushed deeply, thinking that he was kind, explained well, and was also handsome. She lowered her head then the girl raised her head and exclaimed that she needed to study. After a while, night fell. The protagonist entered the shelter and wondered if they had finished collecting corpses. Director Junmo opened his mouth wide when he saw the protagonist. The protagonist approached them and asked if they were here too. Junmo raised his hand and asked him where he had been, since he was supposed to be checking on the gathering, and the protagonist replied that he had been tutoring. A man picked up a monster carcass, and Junmo said that he had called the gathering team to many hunting grounds many times before. The workers were putting the monster carcasses into boxes, and Junmo said that this was the first time he had called so many people to gather horned rabbits. Indeed, there were many workers standing there, namely 352 people. Junmo crossed his arms and asked if Sangwoo had checked the settlement he had sent, and the young man picked up his phone and said that he had turned off notifications, so he hadn't seen it yet. He looked and saw that he had received over 30 million won from the agency. He opened his mouth wide and screamed. The protagonist smiled and asked if it was really supposed to be that much. Junmo widened his eyes and said that his hunting skills were above F class, so he changed the calculation to 83%, which is equivalent to E class. The protagonist put his hand to his head and thanked him. Suddenly, a man opened his mouth and called out to them. They all turned around. The man pointed his finger at him and asked if he was the manager of that worm. He pointed his finger at the clone of the protagonist. Junmo stood in front of him and asked the man who he was. The man frowned and said that he was a hunter whose prey was stolen. He looked at the machine gun and said that all the horned rabbits he aimed at were killed by him, so today's hunt was a complete failure. He grabbed his shoulder and said that he thought they should compensate him for his expenses. A drop of sweat rolled down Junmo's cheek. He put his hand on his chin and told the protagonist that they seemed to have chosen the wrong spot. The protagonist said that he didn't know there were people like that. He put his hand on his chin. The protagonist thought about it, looked at him, and said that he had an idea. The man frowned and wondered with displeasure what they were whispering about. He extended his hand and said that he had a conscience and therefore he only wanted 10% of the profits. The protagonist's mouth opened wide. The stranger frowned and asked why he was laughing. Sangwoo put his hand on his clone's shoulder and said that the guy wouldn't be coming for a few days. He then pointed to the side and told Mr. Junmo that they needed to go, but the man started yelling angrily. They passed him and the protagonist asked why they didn't go sit at the coffee shop on the corner. The stranger grinned terribly in anger. He raised his hand and shouted for Sangwoo not to ignore him. The protagonist frowned and number one's eyes lit up. His fist was right in the clone's face. The man punched the protagonist's clone. The clone flew back from the punch, hit several boxes like a ball, and eventually slammed into the wall and stopped. Blood started coming out of number one's mouth. The man opened his mouth wide and shouted that he hadn't hit him that hard. Sangwoo was holding his phone and shouting about how cruel the man was. He opened his mouth wide and started talking about how this was an act of violence on a sacred hunting ground, so people wouldn't let it go that easily. The stranger looked around and was very worried. The protagonist closed his eyes and exclaimed that it would be really bad if this video leaked online. At the same time, he thought that it would be shocking news. The man frowned and lowered his head. The protagonist showed him the video. The man stood with his head down and Sangwoo suggested that they part ways on good terms. The man suddenly bared his teeth and finally resigned himself to it. After a while they were sitting in a cafe. The protagonist opened his eyes wide and asked about the Hong Guild. Junmo pointed and said that he thought the hunter who attacked him today belonged to that guild. The clone was also sitting next to them and Junmo said that since the Hong Guild is huge, all kinds of people gather there. The protagonist extended his hand and asked how Junmo knew that the man was from the Hong Guild. The agent remembered the man sitting behind him and so he said that the hunter had been keeping an eye on him ever since he came to collect the corpses. A tear rolled down his cheek and he became worried about something. The protagonist frowned and said that he understood that they might want revenge. Junmo closed his eyes and said that they did this because they thought that his clone was another hunter who had made a contract with them. Even before that, the hunters of the JEM agency were being bullied. Sangwoo drank juice while the agent talked about how they did not stay with them for long and that everyone was leaving. At the moment, only a few F-class hunters remained, including the protagonist. He lowered his head and said that even now he cannot promise that there will be no more problems from the Heesung Guild. The protagonist handed over a glass and asked not to force him to change his mind because he already knew everything but still joined, so Junmo did not need to worry. A drop of sweat rolled down the man's cheek. Sangwoo widened his eyes and said that he would not let them get away with this. Then the protagonist smiled and said that he had a plan to become stronger in a short time. He raised his hands and began to talk. Junmo looked at him in surprise. They continued to sit at the table and discussed the plan. After a while, the protagonist smiled and asked Junmo what he thought about it. The man put his hand to his chin and said that he had never thought about it. He started writing something in a notebook and said that he was free tomorrow afternoon. He suggested meeting at a hunter shop. There were many hunters in the building. The trade in weapons, armor, and other items for hunting was active from the very beginning. Many hunters were walking around the shop. These department stores had gotten into the hunting industry, taking over a large part of the market. Thanks to this, you could find everything you could imagine there. The protagonist put on the armor. The consultant extended his hand and said that this protective gear was made of titanium. It would provide the protagonist with guaranteed protection from E-class monsters. Sangwoo smiled and said that the armor was quite light and comfortable, so he liked it. He picked up a knife. Sangwoo tested its sharpness and said that he would be mastering pistols, so he thought that was enough. He turned around and asked the consultant to give him 2 more sets of weapons and armor. After a while, he was holding a suitcase with equipment in his hands. Junmo looked at him and reminded him that the protagonist also said he needed skills. The protagonist looked away and said that he was looking for familiar skills, although he was not sure if there was one there. Then, they entered a store. There was a shiny sphere on the table. The protagonist looked at the display case. He looked at the sphere and happily exclaimed that this was what he was looking for. The protagonist looked at the description of the item, which allows the hunter to share his senses and vision with the creatures and pets he summoned. However, this item cost about 13 won, though the protagonist covered his eyes with his hand. He waved his hands and said that he thought it was time to take their relationship to the next level. Junmo looked at his phone and said that he wasn't sure if it was enough, but he thought he could lend the protagonist 50 million won right now. The protagonist smiled and said that he thought he could handle the rest. He looked at the sphere again and told him not to worry. In the reflection, he could see Sangwoo's face saying that if things didn't go as planned, they would recoup their investment in no time. After a while, he put the items on the floor. Sangwoo was reading the instructions. He opened his eyes wide and said that they needed to pour mana into the sphere, and for users who couldn't control mana, they needed to turn on the sphere while keeping it in contact with their body. The protagonist picked up a remote control and wondered if it was a power button. He placed his hand on the sphere. His face was tense, and his hand was shaking. Sangwoo closed his eyes and pressed a button. A bright light lit up the room. Nothing could be seen because of the strong light, and after a moment the system notified them that a new level 1 skill had been created. Sangwoo looked at his hands in shock. Then he looked to the side and found that the skill ball had disappeared. The youth clenched his fists and mentally said that the skill was now ready to use. He knelt down and ordered the clones to come over. The clones began to walk toward him. They were dressed in the armor that Sangwoo had bought for them. The protagonist looked at them and said that it was time for them to go. After a while, Sangwoo raised his hands and asked Junmo what he thought of the results of the hunt. Junmo raised his hand and said that, of course, everything went great and he did not expect such a result. The protagonist frowned and said that, like him, the endurance, agility, and clones were only half his capabilities, but one of them killed more than 300 rabbits. A man punched the clone in the face. The clone flew back, and the protagonist mentally said that he had ordered the clone to get hit and suffer from it in the most dramatic way. Besides, it is not that easy to calculate the timing perfectly and fearlessly put your face in front of a punch. The protagonist looked at Junmo and said that he thought the man could actually punch the clone in the face if he wanted to. Junmo widened his eyes and asked if Sangwoo was saying that despite their low stats, they were able to control the clones better. The protagonist gave a thumbs up and said that he would take advantage of this. He gave 2 fingers and said that they needed to visit 2 places first. He started talking about a training ground where he was going to learn long-range and close-range attacks using weapons. A man in a kimono looked at them and happily asked if they really came to register. The man in the cap smiled and exclaimed that he would now prepare everything for them to learn how to shoot. 2 clones also walked with the protagonist and trained. The 2 men looked at them in shock because in the first case they decided to immediately move on to sparring, and in the shooting range they immediately wanted to pick up a gun and start shooting. The man knocked the stick out of the sparring partner's hands and said that they needed to attack the hand so that the opponent would drop the stick. Then the man turned around and asked if he was a hunter, but did he really want to fight right away? The shooting instructor took his cap in his hand and asked if they knew what clay pigeon shooting was and if they were sure they wanted to take a gun. The clones frowned and said that they were sure of it. The second one held sticks in his hands and the first one held a real gun. The man picked up the remote control and said that they were starting. The trainer in the kimono held his hand out in front of them and started the countdown. And so, one of them began to fight, and the second one began to shoot at the clay pigeons from the shooting range. The second one hit the bald man with a stick. The first clone hit the plate, and it shattered into pieces. The coach's eyes widened in surprise. The shooting instructor looked up in shock. The second clone held sticks in his hands. The first one held a gun. Sangwoo was drinking juice at the table and talking about how he needed the familiar skill. Junmo's eyes widened in shock, and he wondered. The agent looked at the protagonist in surprise and asked if this wasn't a skill for sharing vision with a pet. Sangwoo replied that it wasn't just for that. He pointed and said that it was important that all senses were combined, including smell and touch. The protagonist stood in front of several tin cans while thinking about how he could use this skill while his clones were training, fighting, or shooting. Sangwoo closed his eyes and activated the skill. A blue aura appeared around him. Everything around him darkened, and he thought that he could experience everything. Meanwhile, the first clone was fighting. A bald man was running toward him. The second one frowned, then immediately lowered his head back and dodged the blow. The protagonist said that he could feel the angle of the joints and the balance of the body. The clone dodged back. Then the clone raised his head, and the protagonist felt the movement of each muscle and the flow of power. Meanwhile, the first clone took out a gun. He pointed it forward, and the protagonist felt the aim in the direction of the gaze. The clone fired. The plate appeared in the sky. The bullet broke the plate into pieces. A blue aura emanated from Sangwoo. His eyes were closed. He closed his eyes. The protagonist smiled and said that he could have all of this. The aura was still raging around him. He looked at his hand. Sangwoo lowered his head and thought about the experience he had just had. He remembered the air pressure when a stick flew past. He also thought about the smell of gunpowder and the force of the recoil. His hand was shaking. He felt tired. He imagined himself as if he were a puppet, and thought that, of course, he did not move a muscle. All the work was done for him by his clones, and he only shared their feelings. The protagonist imagined how to aim and mentally said that he experienced the movements of clones who had the same body as him. Sangwoo looked at his hand and thought that he could imitate these movements right now. Then the system notified him that his strength and reaction speed had increased. The protagonist warmed up his hands and said that today he would try sparring and shooting. He closed his eyes and activated the skill. A blue aura appeared around him. The action moved to the gym. The clone of the protagonist was holding sticks in his hands. A man in a kimono was standing opposite him. The protagonist frowned and realized that this man looked strong. The men around them were surprised that the trainer was going to spar with the newbie himself. They stood opposite each other. Then the protagonist knocked one of the sticks out of his hands. He struck from above. The man frowned and parried the attacks. Thinking that the clone's strikes did not feel experienced, it seemed that he was not used to the clone dodged the attack, and so the man realized that defense was a completely different matter because the clone predicted his movements and perfectly dodged his attacks. The man raised his hand up and struck with the stick, but the clone blocked the attack. The clone looked at him from below. Then he immediately swung his hand. They crossed sticks and the clone looked at him closely. The man frowned and thought that this attack was quite strong. The clone had immediately copied his fighting style. The coach frowned and looked at him. He hit the clone from above, but the clone dodged. The men opened their mouths wide in surprise. The clone immediately swung his stick and hit the coach in the chest. The coach bared his teeth in pain. He turned around and realized that he had hit a wall. The protagonist raised his hand above himself and was about to attack. For some reason, the coach smiled. He immediately bounced off the wall and found himself in the air. The protagonist opened his eyes in shock. The coach hit him in the arm and broke his sticks. The man frowned and looked down. Everyone around smiled and said that their coach was no slouch either, but it was a very close fight. The protagonist cried from the pain in his wrist. The coach smiled and said that it was dangerous. He held out the stick and asked if the protagonist wanted to continue. A drop of sweat rolled down Sangwoo's cheek, and he asked the clone if he was okay. The clone lowered his head. In an instant, he was right above the coach. All the men in the room opened their mouths wide in surprise. The coach also opened his mouth wide. The protagonist looked down and asked if he wanted to continue. The protagonist knelt down. He then stood up, picked up the stick, and said that he wanted another fight. The coach closed his eyes and agreed to it. The protagonist looked ahead and said that it was time to switch to numbers 2. A blue aura appeared around number 1. In an instant, the plate shattered into pieces. A man smiled and braggingly asked his girlfriend if she saw what he did. The girl smiled happily and exclaimed that he was very cool. The protagonist frowned and thought about not saying anything. Sangwoo looked at the second clone in shock and mentally said that the clone was even shooting at the targets of the person behind him. He opened his eyes wide and realized that he needed to concentrate on shooting. The plate was in the air. The clone raised his gun, and the protagonist thought about fixing the position of his upper body. He aimed and thought about not moving, only turning in the direction of movement, following the trajectory of the plate. The plate was already in the sights, and Sangwoo thought that when the target and the expected trajectory converged, he needed to shoot. The plate shattered into pieces. Smoke came out of the barrel of the gun. The clone raised his head and looked at the broken plate. It crumbled into pieces and fell. Sangwoo mentally said that he needed to remember every little detail. He opened his eyes wide and looked at the falling fragments, thinking that he must learn everything his clones were capable of. After a while, the sunset came. A blue aura was coming from Sangwoo. The protagonist opened his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his chin and said that switching between the first and second clone was tiring. His vision started to blur. He covered his face with his hand and thought that his mana had run out and he was feeling tired, so he needed to rest. The protagonist was breathing heavily. He sat down on the bench and started thinking that the clone's movements were just crazy. They didn't doubt or fear anything at all, so they moved as they needed to. Sangwoo could feel the wind when the clone dodged the stick. He looked into the distance and thought that next time he would go with them, because he should see what would happen if he tried it himself. Meanwhile, someone was walking towards him. A girl looked at the protagonist. The protagonist's eyes widened when he heard the girl call him teacher. He was standing in front of him. He opened his mouth wide and asked what she was doing there so late, and the girl replied that she had been studying at the library. Several bandits were looking at them from behind. While the protagonist and the girl were chatting pleasantly, a man was smoking a cigarette and smiling. The 3 men nearby were frowning and looking at the protagonist. One of them was holding a phone in his hand. The man frowned and began to apologize to the person on the call, saying that he only wanted to scare Jumbo Mo a little, but it turned out their conversation had been recorded. A drop of sweat rolled down his forehead as the interlocutor asked if his threats had really been recorded. The man lowered his head and shouted that he would find out everything, but the interlocutor reminded him not to say anything there and to stay away from Eugen's territory. The man stood illuminated by the yellow rays of the sun. His interlocutor also told him not to mention any connection with the Heisen Guild. The man turned red with anger when the caller told him to call himself just a simple street hooligan. He smashed the phone against the wall. The man started screaming and kicking the phone. Suddenly, he turned around because he heard someone ask why he was angry again. The man in front of him was smiling and saying that he hadn't seen him in a long time. Kunok smiled widely, looked at the man, and then asked what had happened. 3 cigarette butts were lying on the ground. The 3 of them stood in front of each other, and Kunok asked if the man had really done nothing and just let them go. Kunok took a cigarette in his hand and said that he knew this would happen when the man got excited about joining the first guild in the country. The man looked down and said that the guild told him not to go near the Eugen territory. Kunok looked at the long-haired man and told him to find some part-time work. The man then looked into the distance and saw Sangwoo sitting on a bench. He immediately extended his hand and pointed at the protagonist, exclaiming that he was the one who had recorded him on video. He immediately walked toward him, but Junsak ordered him to calm down. The man was holding onto the corner of a wall, watching the protagonist from around it, clearly furious. They were looking at Sangwoo, who was happily chatting with Yang. The girl looked at the protagonist and asked what he was doing there. He replied that he was just training. Then they both looked away because someone called out to them. A man was walking toward them and talking about how their little brother owed the protagonist something. Junig was walking toward him, smiling. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek, and he said that he had no idea who these people were. He saw that the man was grinning angrily. The protagonist widened his eyes and immediately remembered what was going on. The protagonist stood up and asked what he could do to help them. The man frowned deeply. He opened his mouth wide and started shouting, but Junak smiled and asked him to calm down. Junak smiled creepily and said that he heard the protagonist had a video of his little brother making a mistake due to his emotions. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek. Junjak suggested they delete the video and peacefully disperse. He held out his phone and asked if they would really let him go if he deleted the video. Junjak also held his hand and said that he didn't like doing tedious work either. The protagonist's hand began to shake. Junjak lowered his head when the protagonist asked if there was any guarantee that they would really let him go. The man smiled, put his hand to his chin, and said that Sangwoo was smart because he really wouldn't leave there without getting beaten. Sangwoo hung his head, and Jongmek said that he wasn't smart enough to delete the video right after recording it, so now it made no difference. I opened her mouth wide in excitement because the protagonist quietly told her to run as soon as she had the chance. The bandit had already started to stretch his arms. The protagonist frowned and mentally said that he didn't think he'd be in such a difficult situation so soon. He got into a fighting stance and said that he would beat them all up. The bandit pointed at him and laughed, saying that he was quite confident in himself. The two men ran toward the protagonist, and Junyak stood behind them, telling them to beat the boy up good. Sangwoo dodged a punch, then another. The man kicked him, and the protagonist bared his teeth as he flew back. Then he was hit on the chin. Hai opened her mouth wide and started screaming his name. Sangwoo fell to the ground. Blood came out of his mouth. He started to get up, thinking that it didn't work the first time. He was lying on the ground behind him. The girl had materialized some kind of sphere. She held the sphere in front of her and shouted at them to step back. Sangwoo bared his teeth as he looked at her. His eyes widened in surprise. The girl was shaking in fear. The man looked at her in shock and wondered if she was really awakened. Hunyo then hit him on the back of the head and asked. Displeasure filled the air. Were they really scared of a schoolgirl? Held the sphere in front of her. Hunuk smiled and asked what would happen if they continued to advance. She opened her mouth wide and shouted at them to step back. Hanok-jo rushed at her. She bared her teeth, and Hying shot the sphere at them. The ball flew into the man's stomach area. In a moment, everything was engulfed in fog. The men covered their faces with their hands. The bandit's smile was visible through the mist, and he said that awakened ones were now like stones on the road. His t-shirt had burned off, revealing his tattooed body, and then he said there was nothing to brag about. He immediately raised his hand and told Hang to grow up. The protagonist quickly blocked the punch. He frowned at the bandit and said it wasn't over yet. Sangwoo punched him back. The man's hand relaxed and his mouth opened wide in surprise. The protagonist bared his teeth. Junio grabbed his face and stepped back. The protagonist remained in a fighting stance, baring his teeth again, thinking that he was starting to understand it wasn't enough to just copy the clan's movements. The man swung his fist, and Sangwoo, looking at his shoulder, realized he should move in advance to avoid being hit. The young man dodged and thought about how a punch wasn't just about swinging one's arms. He imagined the structure of the muscles and mentally noted that the momentum starts from the legs, then moves to the waist. He swung, thinking the momentum then transfers from the waist to the arm. The protagonist delivered a powerful punch. Another bandit attacked him from the side, and he realized he couldn't avoid it. The bandit would hit him. The protagonist took the blow and counterattacked. The bandit fell to the ground, and Sangwoo remained in his stance, breathing heavily. Junak smiled and asked if he really knew how to fight. His eyes glowed red, and he said he was hesitant to hit someone who couldn't even swing his fist properly. Sangwoo stood ready and thought that he still felt the pain from the last fight. He blocked the attack, thinking that he had withstood it before. But if Junak was this strong, did he really have a skill related to enhancing muscle strength? The protagonist clenched his fists and mentally exclaimed that he couldn't just let him hit him like that. Junak ran at him, smiling. The protagonist hit him back. Then again, the thug closed his eyes and called the protagonist a name, then immediately reached out toward him. The young man punched the thug in the face, thinking he needed to hit him hard and knock him out. Junjio swung his hand, but Sangwoo ducked and dodged. He then delivered a powerful uppercut. Another thug lying on the ground watched them. Sangwoo's eyes widened in surprise. Jun grinned widely. His face seemed to glow and the veins on his arms lit up. The thug swung his arm and said that Sangwoo was already a corpse. Venos Shah stood his ground and thought he needed to dodge such a swing. However, suddenly his leg was grabbed. The protagonist lowered his head and saw the thug holding his leg. He smiled and raised his head, realizing he'd been caught. Junak hit him, and he fell. He opened his mouth wide and exhaled all the air from his lungs. Haeyang began to cry and scream. The protagonist hit his back against a pole. He knelt down, clutching his chest, thinking about how hard it was. He lowered his head, struggling to breathe, as Jun continued to mock him. The boy clutched his chest, breathing heavily. He looked at Jun with a frown. Jun took a wide swing, about to hit. The protagonist thought, "This is the end." Everything around him became foggy. Juni opened his mouth and groaned in pain. The protagonist looked up in shock. Hong had attacked him with her ability. Two bandits were lying on the ground, cursing. They charged at her, but the protagonist shouted that she should have run. Sangwoo's clones immediately dealt with the remaining two bandits. Hyang's mouth opened in surprise as she looked at the second clone. Junak turned around, wondering what was going on. The protagonist raised his hand, wiped the blood from his lip, and said that he could finally breathe. Sangwoo clenched his fist as Junsak started yelling at him. The boy smiled and looked at him, then jumped off the wall and landed in the air. He looked down and thanked him for the practical test. Then Sangwoo kicked him, and Jun fell. After a while, the boy was sitting up, trying to catch his breath. Jung Myuk was unconscious. The other bandit was also lying on the ground. The system notified the protagonist that he had gained muscle strength and endurance, and that his cloning skill had been raised to level 3. The protagonist smiled while looking at the system window. He then raised his head. The clones were running toward him as he lay down and closed his eyes. Night had fallen. The girl wrapped bandages around her arms. The protagonist asked her why she didn't run away when she had the chance. She turned around and said that she didn't think that was what he wanted to say. Hang's eyes widened and she said that she was really surprised and still couldn't believe that the famous rookie hunter was actually a clone of Sangwoo. She remembered how the first clone had stood in front of the protagonist. The boy put his hand to his chin and asked her not to tell anyone about this. Had blushed, looked at him, and said that she understood and